Picture yourself standing in a trench carved deep into Belgian mud, April 1915. The air is thick with the stench of decay, wet earth, and unwashed bodies pressed together in a maze of sandbags and timber. You hear the distant rumble of artillery, the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle, and then silence. An unnatural, terrifying silence that makes every man freeze. Then you see it, a yellow-green cloud rolling across no man's land like fog, but moving with purpose, hugging the ground, creeping toward your position with the patience of death itself. This is chlorine gas, and you have no mask. In these desperate moments, Allied soldiers discovered a technique so crude, so visceral, that military historians have largely erased it from sanitized textbooks. They urinated on whatever cloth they could find and pressed it against their faces, using their own waste as the only barrier between survival and suffocation. The logic was born from panic and confirmed through tragic observation. When chlorine gas enters the lungs, it reacts with moisture to form hydrochloric acid, essentially drowning victims in their own corroded lung tissue. But ammonia, present in human urine, could neutralize chlorine through a simple chemical reaction. Canadian physicians and frontline officers noticed that soldiers who happened to relieve themselves on rags during the chaos had marginally better survival rates. Word spread through the trenches faster than official orders ever could. Men were instructed to soak handkerchiefs, socks, or any available fabric in their own urine and tie it tightly over their mouths and noses. The technique bought precious seconds, perhaps a minute or two of filtered breathing, just enough time to retreat from the densest part of the cloud or to reach higher ground where the heavier-than-air gas couldn't follow. But chemical warfare changed everything about trench life beyond the attacks themselves. Soldiers developed an entirely new relationship with their environment, one governed by constant vigilance and improvised protection. They learned to read the wind with the intensity of ancient mariners, knowing that a shift in breeze could send yesterday's gas cloud back into their own lines. They slept in shifts, always keeping watchers who would ring bells or sound klaxons at the first sign of the telltale mist. The trenches themselves became layered fortifications against this invisible enemy. Men dug deeper sumps and drainage channels, understanding that chlorine and phosgene, being heavier than air, would sink into low points. They covered these sumps with duckboards, creating false floors that kept them literally above the poison that pooled below. Water discipline took on new meaning in this contaminated landscape. Every drop had to be tested, sniffed, examined for the oily sheen that might indicate mustard gas contamination. Soldiers learned to collect rainwater in steel helmets before it touched the ground, understanding that the earth itself had become suspect. They boiled everything, even when fuel was scarce, and shared canteens only with men from their immediate squad, a practice that built bonds of trust as strong as family. Food became another vector of concern. Bread had to be stored in gas-proof containers, improvised from ammunition boxes sealed with mud and clay. Men learned to eat quickly during quiet periods, understanding that a gas attack would force them to choose between the mosque and the meal. Within months, the urine-soaked rag gave way to more sophisticated but still primitive solutions. The British issued flannel hoods soaked in sodium thiosulfate, the same chemical used by photographers to fix images. These hypo-helmets transformed soldiers into ghoulish figures, faceless and anonymous, able to breathe for perhaps 15 minutes in contaminated air. Yet even as technology advanced, the core principle remained: layering. Soldiers learned to wear their uniforms tight, to wrap puttees, those spiral leg wrappings, with obsessive precision, creating barriers against gases that could blister skin on contact. Scottish regiments, with their traditional kilts, faced unique vulnerabilities to mustard gas and resorted to wearing women's stockings beneath their kilts, a practice born of necessity that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The trenches taught men to think in terms of zones and barriers. Near the front, they spread chlorine of lime, calcium hypochlorite, in thick layers on duckboards and trench floors. This white powder served as a chemical trap, deactivating persistent agents before they could vaporize again in the morning dew. They learned to recognize contaminated areas by watching rats, those unwilling allies who would avoid poisoned ground with an instinct men came to trust more than official all-clear signals. Camouflage took on new dimensions as well. Beyond hiding from snipers, soldiers learned to disguise the very air they exhaled. A cough, a visible breath on a cold morning could draw fire. They breathed through their noses, shallow and controlled, conserving energy and minimizing their signature in an environment where the enemy watched through periscopes and listened through the earth itself. Today, when we discuss preparedness and fieldcraft, we often focus on gear, on the latest innovations in survival technology. But the soldiers of the Great War teach us something more fundamental. Adaptability is the ultimate survival skill. They took the most basic biological function and transformed it into a life-saving technique. They read the land, the wind, and the water with an intensity born of necessity. They understood that survival isn't about perfection, it's about buying time, creating margins, and never surrendering the will to adapt. These men didn't have the luxury of online forums or survival manuals. They had mud, fear, and the desperate creativity that emerges when death comes as mist. If this story resonates with you, if you understand that true preparedness means learning from those who survived the unthinkable, then you're part of the Fieldcraft Chronicles community. Subscribe to this channel, share this episode with others who value history and self-reliance, and remember that every technique we take for granted was once discovered by someone who had no choice but to innovate or die.